So again, just invite you to use the chat box for messages of organizations that we should be looking at and supporting. We'll do that each time. Invite you all to connect where you are in the world. And then in a moment, Morley, I'm going to turn it over to you. And just grateful once again, Morley, for your presence and helping us ground inside ourselves, inside this community. So thank you. Morley, I'll turn it over to you to get us started. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Zander. Hello, everyone. Let's bring our awareness to our bodies. We are staring at these screens and doing important work and using our eyes and our mind and our necks. So let's sit up really comfortably and maybe come to the edge of your chair so you can feel your feet flat on the ground. And if you're not on the screen and you're lying down, that's perfect too. As long as you're lots of space in the spine. And let's bring the hands, right hand to the belly and left hand to the chest. And just feel that warmth of your hands resting on your body. Feel that comfort. And let's start by squeezing the shoulders all the way up slowly to the ears. And then rolling them back down. So we're lifting the shoulders up and then rolling them back and down. Just do that one more time. Just bringing the shoulders all the way up to the ears and let them fall, cascade down the spine. And let's drop the chin to the chest. And breathe right with your chin to your chest. Breathe right in between your shoulder blades. Just bring a nice deep breath. And then exhale and slowly lift your head. Beautiful. And let the head fall to your ear. Let your right ear fall to your right shoulder. I'll be your mirror. Yeah, and inhale, lift your head and drop your head to the other side. Just breathe into that space. We're holding a lot of energy in our neck, right? And lift the head up and give yourself a nice circle of the head. Feeling the warmth on your body from your hands. You can circle your head very slowly, 3 times each direction. Just if you hear that snap, crackle, that's good. That's a good thing. You keep the breath flowing. Take your time. Breathe really slowly in and out if you can through the nose, and then reverse the circle. These very subtle movements are so important and can help us, with mental alertness and creativity. We take the tension out of this part of the body that's working more than usual at these at-home workspaces. Good, and when you're ready, like that, let's bring our arms over our head and stretch the body long. You can interlace the hands and turn them over and stretch. Yeah, and lean to the right. And feel that space in between the ribs and the left. And then open the arms really wide. Feel your wingspan. Feel your wingspan. Good. And let's bring the right hand again to the belly and the left hand to the chest. And we'll just do a few breaths together, feeling the power of the circle. Breathing together. Inhale into your right hand for 3 counts. And then feel the chest rise. Breathe into the chest. Exhale, soft belly and soft chest. Inhale, belly rises. Chest expands, back expands. Beautiful. Exhale, belly softens. And chest softens. This is the breathing we do while we're sleeping. Full body breath. Inhale, belly rises. Chest expands. Exhale, soft belly and soft heart. You can keep your eyes closed or open just enough to let the light in. Full body breath. Feel your body soften on the exhale and let your shoulders become water. And take a few more breaths like this, feeling the connection of your feet on the earth and the crown of the head towards the sky. With the awareness that our body is an exchange place for information and medicine from the earth to the sky and from the sky to the earth all day. We keep ourselves open to receive this information and medicine. Beautiful. And slowly bring your right hand to meet your left hand over your heart. And I'll quote Thich Nhat Hanh. Breathing in, I touch my heart. Breathing out, I smile to my heart. Thank you, heart. Thank you, community. And thank you for this opportunity to be together. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you, Morley, as always. Appreciate you. Thank you, everyone, for joining the Evolution series and just coming together. As you know, part of this series is to be grounded and to learn how to metabolize and come together all that's happening to us. In each of these sessions, we've tried to feature an organization that's helping people without some of the safety net that others of us have. And so I just wanted to invite Bernie, a good friend, an amazing human, just to spend a few moments. Bernie, you're on mute, just so you know, just to quickly talk about an effort you're putting forth, and then we'll share more information at the end with slides and information. But Bernie, can you just share what you're working on?
Sure, great. Good morning, everyone. Super excited to see just like-minded hearts and people, and I love that we started with that grounding exercise. I just wanted to share, I'm based in the New York City area, and as many of you know, this area in particular has been really ravaged by what's going on with the pandemic. And a few weeks ago, a number of just like-minded folks sitting at home trying to figure out how can we be more impactful, really decided to try and tackle the issue of unemployment due to the epidemic. Especially when you're from the New York area, you think of what makes this area special and touches your heart and makes these cities vibrant and the experience. It's restaurant owners, it's your favorite maitre d', it's the great nail shop. And really, there's just a lot of people in the service industry who are suffering. Employers, private employers who have nannies and house cleaning people. I mean, when you just think of your own personal network of really the village that makes your life possible. So what we did is we came together. It's called the 1K Project, and it's a wonderful experience where we're trying to find and match sponsor families. Employers will refer past employees who they've had to furlough. Individuals can also nominate families that they know are in need, and we match them with sponsors who are willing to provide $1,000 a month for the next 3 months. We particularly think that the $1,000 a month is impactful because I think in many instances, what we're reading, and we've already funded 75 families, and that's continuing to grow, is that people, really, they don't need $100 or 200. These are folks who just need to get back on their feet in the next 3 months once employment kind of comes back. And $1,000 can go a long way in helping people offset rent, utilities. Our focus is families, and so families with dependents. And yeah, that's really what it's about. It's a grassroots thing, and it kind of came about, and it's just continuing to grow and evolve. We're getting, right now, actually, we have more sponsors than we have families. And so my ask of people is that please connect us. If you have any local businesses, any small business folks that who might know people who are hurting right now. I always tell people that I think it's a great time to open up a conversation to just check in on those in your village and just to ask, frankly, people, how are you doing and how are you doing financially? Just by doing that, You know, I myself have found a variety of people who I realized are hurting financially much more than I actually thought they were. And so, so yes, that's in essence the project. And, you know, I know you guys will get some details. So I hope you'll send it along if you know of any families who are in need.
Thank you so much, Bernie. We'll share some information at the end. Again, what we're trying to do in these sessions is try and figure out what safety net we have and can provide for each other, and how do we support others who don't have the same safety net. So please keep sharing those in the chat. So what we're going to focus on today, in the same format we've been doing, sort of sharing some ideas and frameworks, coming together in small groups, and then using the last half hour for Q&A, is this idea of an adaptive audit, idea of where is our capacity to change and how do we understand it. And so we're going to do some sort of practical framing of that today, and then get into some of the small groups. So I'm going to launch into the ideas. Again, it's useful to sort of sometimes have pen and paper. We've been a little behind in getting the slides out to these sessions to everyone, and we're committed to doing that, so that will come. Just wanted to note that as well. Part of what we've been doing here in the evolution series, a gentle reminder, we're going through this adaptive change that we were not prepared for. Part of what we're doing is trying to equip our capacity for ourselves for today and the future, and remembering that this requires us to both look inwards and outwards, and that the path, as Bernie was helping us see, is about getting through this together, not just on our own. We know that this will fall, or the burden of this crisis will fall unevenly on people in our communities or our village. And so how do we support each other? We wanted to just, again, share our daily prayers for our loved ones, both the people who we know and the people who we care for, and others we don't yet know. Sort of a prayer that the lessons we need to learn will come as gently as possible, and that there's an inclusive future for us that minimizes some of the suffering that's happening. The evolution series just continues. We're continuing every Tuesday. Next week, out of the request of a bunch of people, we're going to focus on kind of authority and leadership. How is leadership and authority being deployed in beautiful ways and less attractive and ugly ways in this crisis? How do we understand the distinctions between leadership and authority? How do we engage in it? How do we understand it? So that will be some of our focus for next week. Also, as kind of part of the request that people have asked for, we're going to launch some programs to go deeper. Many people have realized that this evolution series is an introduction to ideas and want to figure out how do they internalize and embody them. And so we're going to be introducing this master class, this trusted advisor program, and some other workshops and peer cohorts. So just stay tuned for that stuff. So today we're going to drive into this adaptive audit. Just one nice thing of note, it's springtime. This is the tree that I passed on my walk over here. This is a cherry blossom tree. It's a tree normally every year that me and my children will sit under and enjoy, although they're home being schooled and digital devices. And this cherry blossom sakura tree is always both a symbol of spring, but it's also a symbol of how precious life is. We know that these blossoms only last for 2 weeks at the most. My favorite time is actually to kind of sit under them after they've had their peak, when the wind blows and the petals fall off of them. And it's just always this reminder of how precious life is, and precious time just to be together. So just a brief reminder before we launch into the adaptive work and the adaptive audit and adaptive capacity, that adaptive change is sort of the move from current reality to a new future. And as we've talked about in other sessions, that technical work, which is God's work too, is just the work we do that's part of the routine of today, of the world and reality we have today. And so as we launch into this and we try to think about where does adaptive capacity come from? We all are in this moment now where we know things are changing, but we want to match kind of that knowledge that things have to change with the capacity to do the change. As we think about that, we know that there's kind of 4 elements. The first element is awareness. What are we aware of that needs to change? How do we understand where our system is wonderful and can be where it is and coast, and where does it need to change? We also, the next thing we have to think about is, where is our will? Where is the conviction? Where is the courage? Where is the willingness to change? That will also has to be met with bandwidth. What is our bandwidth and capacity to change? And then lastly, what's our skill set? So as we think about adaptive capacity and we think about the changes that are coming that we have to face, we want to match that awareness with the will and skill and bandwidth to do the work. And as we think about this, many of us are on this call are in very different positions. So I invite you just to think about whether you want to use this as a personal frame or as an organizational frame, as an institution frame on either end of that. And we can apply these ideas either way. As we try and search for what is the adaptive bandwidth that we have, we know that there's a certain amount of bandwidth that has to go to just survival. For many of us, some of that is food and shelter and the basic needs. For others of us who have pain or depression or trauma, that the work of being alive and surviving is about dealing with some of those realities. We also know that part of being alive is just the routine of what we do, the routine of what we perform every day, the routine rote practices of our jobs and our life. And that what remains on top of that is our adaptive bandwidth. As a person, what's that space of discretionary attention where we ask beautiful, creative, harder questions? As an institution's beyond what we need to do just to keep the lights on, between the routine of running our businesses, our philanthropy, what space do we have to consider what is possible? And of course, each person is different. Each organization is different. I always am interested when people say, I'm here, I'm ready to change, and they have very little bandwidth to do that. And so we think about these three factors inside of ourselves and inside our institutions. We also know that it's quite different. In some people and some institutions, the breakdown looks more like this, that the survival it takes to exist and maintain and just get our needs met requires much more of our total time and attention, that our routine is kind of takes a smaller piece, and that we have a little space to adapt and grow. For others people, theirs takes less to survive, and they're just in some very deep habits. The routine of their life, the norms that they've got into, the kind of everyday routine where often today looks very similar to yesterday, looks more like this map. And of course, some people are very lucky. Some of us on this call have spaciousness to be on Zoom calls to even think about these things, to wonder what we're going to do with our life, our profession, our families next. But of course, it's very different. The way and capacity we have to change is dependent on where our bandwidth is over these different models. Right? And it's interesting just to think about the organization you're running, the team you're on, the community in, the village you're in personally. What is the space you have for adaptation, for growth, for change, for evolution, for reflection? And it's also fair to say and worth pointing out that none of us have this kind of framework in isolation. That those of us who might have more adaptive space are doing it because there's other people who are providing the services of our survival and routine life. It's really powerful to understand the connections and mechanisms, that the reason that I can do and have this call is because there are essential workers out there who are providing food, doing the farming, putting it on trucks, getting it to me. And that my freedom and liberation to sort of think about these things is dependent on essential workers. That this sort of white collar is dependent on blue collar and other things. So we can start to see how the system exists. We can start to think in the communities and nations where we are, where is the need and sort of bandwidth for survival larger than what's the other pieces? So it's helpful to begin to think about those spaces when we look for this adaptive audit and what's possible. How can we spend less time and honor those who are helping us to survive? How do we manage and make efficient our routine? And how do we create more and more space each week, each day, each conversation for more of the adaptive work to happen? Simultaneously, as we start to think about this, we want to understand what is the work that's in front of us. I want to share a framework that I've adapted from sort of the great Tom Patterson and some of his models. Obviously, if everything is working, then we don't need to adapt. We don't need to have adaptive capacity. But in reality, we know everything's not working. Only a portion of things are working. And so when I work with individuals, when I work with companies, when I work with families, when I work with philanthropy, I want to begin to identify 4 quadrants or 4 subsets of reality to find where the adaptive capacity is. The first thing I want to ask is what's working? People are generally good at being able to answer this. The second thing I want to ask them is what's not working? What are the things that are getting in the way and broken that aren't getting you to the outcomes you want? What are the things that are confusing to you? And what are the things that are missing? And when I ask these questions, that sometimes they seem quite obvious to folks, but what happens is that the nuance is underneath. People are generally good at identifying what's working, and then they get confused or not sure where to put the other pieces. Is it actually not working, or is it confused? Is it not working, or is it missing? And trying to think about those buckets of work help me to identify what is the adaptive capacity or needs moving forward. What's beautiful is you can apply this to almost anything. I am a nerd, so I can apply this to my parenting. What's working in my kids? What's working in my parenting of my kids? What's working in their sense of their self or their resilience? What's working in my consulting practice or my teaching practice? What's working in my health? What's working in the ability for my team to talk about the real issues and name the elephants? All of those things. What's also interesting, when we work with folks or institutions, we know that people have a default. You know the people in your life who the first thing they go to is they'll give you the long list of everything that's not working, or they'll give you this is missing. And so it's useful to understand where those defaults are. But then it's useful to sort of understand what are the different buckets of work. And what's useful when we're trying to do this adaptive change and capacity and audit work is knowing that each one of the buckets of work requires different things. For the stuff that's working, what we want to do there is we want to optimize those things. The things that are working, we just don't want to leave them be. We want to figure out, how do I optimize what's working? How do I drive it to efficiency and beautiful outcomes? For the things that are not working, those are the things that we want to change or need to change. And how do we sort of bring the change around to those things? What's the pace of those change? For the things that are confusing, what's the work to clarify? What do we need to clarify? What do we need to understand in those buckets? And then lastly, for the things that are missing, what do we need to add? And again, we can think about and apply this to our philanthropy, to our business practices, to our teamings, to our marriages. Sometimes in the best marriages and relationship, there's 3 relationships over the lifetime of it. There's times to reevaluate what's working, what's not. Some of the couples I work with, both sort of partner couples, both in business and in marriage and in life, we will go through a practice of this. And when they have shared language to identify these pieces, when I will look at, what happened in the federal program and the loan program, what was working, of how it supported small businesses or not. This helps me understand where the world of work is. So the thing we try to do when we're trying to do this adaptive audit is then kind of go through and identify what is the work in each of these buckets? What is the capacity to deliver on these? And as we understand this map, then we can actually kind of get busy. We can get working on these things. And as I mentioned before, part of what we want to identify is a pause and say, each of the things identified here, which are technical or which are adaptive. A different way of understanding that is trying to understand, for the item here, do I already know how to do it? Do I can do it within my existing capacity? Or do I have to grow into something? And when we can identify these different elements that we have to face, what's not working, and we can sort of do a double click on, do I have the capacity to do this already, or do I have to grow into it? We start to get this beautiful map of what we have to do to move forward, what it'll take to deliver on our promises to evolve. And there's a very beautiful way with which we can then understand, out of the abstract, out of this kind of notion that things have to change, what the exact work is. And we can identify what I already have the capacity to do and what I have to do next. And it's amazing how quickly you can start to identify what's the work. This sort of grew out of my experience of working with individuals and teams saying, well, I know things want to change, but I don't know where to start. In a very quick exercise, we can identify where to start. And then we can walk through each one of those bullets and say, what is the awareness that's here? Is there willingness to change this? Do they actually have the bandwidth to do the work? And do they have the skill sets? Do they have the capacity to do it now? Now, what's really interesting is when I ask people to do this, I never take their first answer as truth. I take it as the first data point. People are not always so good at identifying these bullets. And so part of the work we do with CEOs and elected officials and presidents and other people is to help them refine the list. It's really interesting to say, what are they aware of? Where do they have the willingness? And what would it take to shift some of these? Now, you can imagine this looks quite different if we apply it to individuals or if we apply it to people or organizations. If you think about this as an organization, and this is a lot to look at, we may spend another future session going this in more detail. There are things on the organizational side that can be seen, the structures, the staff, the process, the roles, partnerships. There's also a whole bunch of unseen pieces. How does the culture exist? What are the norms of how people engage? What are the values that are lived or not lived? What are the values that are celebrated and which ones are marginalized? What is the folklore and narratives that exist in the place? What are the capacities that exist? As for individuals, we can think about this in quite a different frame. What are the behaviors that we see from them? What are the faults that they have of how they treat problems and business needs? What are the decision-making protocols and frameworks they use? What is a set of performance management that they have? But underneath that is a set of mental models and hungers and triggers and competencies. What are their personal values? How do those values match against the organization? And so what we start to see is a map of what needs to change. What is the map of what, if we want to get to a different state, which ones of these boxes would we have to check off and work on? And you can imagine how many organizations we go into and all they want to do is get to a different place. So they want to restructure the seen parts of the organization, but they haven't done the work of doing the audit on the individuals. If we change the structure, what does that mean for the people? If we change the people, what does that mean for the culture? And so we can start to see a system in this adaptive audit about what the organization might need or might look like. If we think about this for individuals, for the work we do with ourselves and others, there's a different set of functions we would look at. If we want to think about what is the adaptive capacity of an individual, we'd want to look at a bunch of different pieces of them. We'd want to understand historically what adaptations have they been forced to deal with? What's their history of dealing with change? What's the history of dealing with change they choose or change that was pushed on them? What is their intellectual capacity, emotional, physical? Where do they embody those things? Part of what we're trying to do in adaptive capacity is match the domain with the problem. So part of what we're trying to do with adaptive capacity, when a problem comes at someone and someone feels so at home in their mind, it might not be that the problem requires their intellectual capacity. It might require their set of values or their social intelligence or their emotional intelligence. It might land in different places than what would be required of them in just their habits or defaults. And all of what we're trying to do here is think about what's the problem that's coming at us and how do we meet that with the right set of capacities, with the right awareness, will, skill, and bandwidth to be able to address it. Each of us have different sort of bandwidths and capacity in each of these. We could do a little exercise and sort of look at what has your life reinforced and celebrated in you amongst these, and which of these might be more necessary for the changes that are here today or the changes that are coming. Which of these, in the martial arts metaphor, do you have a black belt in? And which ones do you want to have or need to have more dexterity? Which ones do our political leaders and business leaders and community leaders have wealth in? And which do we want to bring and surround them with other capacities and tools? So again, as we kind of think about what's in front of us and the work in front of us, we start to think about where is this capacity? Where is the capacity of our institutions? Part of me in the way I work and the work I do is all I think I'm doing is trying to fight for and feed my optimism. And my optimism comes from being grounded and trying to identify what is the work and what is the capacity needed to meet it. And in the way we talked a little bit last week, which of those is ripe, which of those needs ripening, which of those needs muscle building in order to move forward. And again, I think we're in this time of great change and great opportunity and great need for change. And we want to sort of do the audit of where is the change necessary and where can we sort of do the work. And so what we want to do is invite you, as always, to sort of move into some small groups and sort of think about what is the next thing that needs to adapt in your institution, in your life, in your community, and what will it take? What's the capacity it'll take to adapt there? And so I'm going to move us into small groups and invite you to have those conversations. As always, we sort of think about what's relevant and right for you. Take a moment to introduce yourself. But again, this framing question of what's the next thing that I need to adapt and what's the capacity it'll take to do that. That's the audit conversations we're looking for. We'll invite you back in about 25 minutes. See you in a moment. You should all have a small window pop up in the corner of your thing that invites you to go to your small groups. Please let me know if you need help getting into the groups. But if you click on that small group, it'll invite you to move into that area. Then take a moment to introduce yourself and then share what's the change in front of you and what's the capacity it'll take to deliver on it. Welcome back. We'll just wait a few moments as people rejoin us from the small group conversations. And as always, we'll hear from at least 3 people from the small groups. Invite you to share comments and organizations in the chat. But it'd be great to hear from folks. So give me one more minute. We have a few who haven't come back yet. And once they do, we'll do that. We found it useful to raise your hand, and so we can sort of identify you and also hear your voice. So if you have a comment from your small group, if you don't mind raising your hand, we'll start that way. And that would be helpful. So we still have a few in the small groups. So let's just give it one more moment. And then please, we'd love to hear from a few of you in your small groups. We'll spend the next few minutes hearing from folks, and then we'll spend the last half hour for everyone who wants to doing more Q&A and storytelling. So feel free to raise your hand if you have a comment or a question from your small group or inspired to share. Helen, let's hear from you first.
Well, so I'm in a situation where I'm trying to get the leaders over me to change behavior, to listen to what people are experiencing and try to get them to move based on that information. One of the most powerful things I heard in our small group, which is just a great suggestion, was that I need to be listening to what people I need to work harder to reach out on the ground to what people are saying, so that I can get those people in the room or communicate the information that they're seeing to our leaders, because the leadership just doesn't want to, or doesn't have the capacity to hear it. So I'm not sure if that made sense in the English language. Maybe someone in our group can articulate it better, but this notion of really working hard to listening to people on the ground and hearing them, I think was really powerful.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And obviously the distinctions between whether they actually see it, whether they want to see it, whether they're open to it, and whether they have the capacity to respond are all different interpretations of, Helen, what your work might be in trying to move some of that forward. Deborah, let's hear from you next.
I just wanted to pick up Emily, who was in our group, had needed to leave, was sharing an element that we had shared together, which was of this lovely model that you'd shared, Zander. It felt as if the missing piece was such a massive part in this time when it's evolving in such a way that we don't know what the future is missing. We don't know how we're going to handle our own emotions or the financials. We don't know if there's what maybe even our own sense of purpose might be in this missing future. Or, and then as she spoke to, was at what point in time is there a letting go even when we don't know what the future is, and therefore going into grief. And so all that element of the missing, which seems to be changing on a daily, weekly basis, and individually, let alone collectively for a team, is huge. And how to leave the space for that felt very important.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Part of what we spent some time on last week was the capacity to let go. And when you have to let go, just saying we have to let go has nothing to do with the capacity to actually do the work. And so that's why we're trying to generate ideas around not just what we have to do, but what's the skill set doing that. One of the biggest lessons in my life is to not ascribe to malice or bad intent what I can ascribe to incompetence. And so trying to understand where are the people just lacking the competence, not just the ignorance or sort of other ideas. We're going to spend the next half hour for anyone who wants to continuing in the Q&A and conversation. I just want to, before we leave, invite us to do two things. One, just to talk about and honor what we've done each time, especially for those in the US. I realize this is a little national based, having the crisis text hotline, but also Bernie's organization that she talked about, the 1K project. And if you're interested in getting involved, we're both looking for people who can benefit from the real financial hardship that they have with children and dependencies to get through these months. And if you know others who want to build that bridge, the 1K project, which you can Google and look up, we'll also share more information about that as well. So just to indicate that, obviously, thank you. And you can follow us and all those things that you can follow. But also we will spend more time this week getting you the documents and frames from what we've shared before. So for those who want to remain, let's continue the conversation with stories, ideas, and questions. It's helpful to raise your hand if we can, so we can see you and hear your voice. But again, all of us in a very real way, I think, are confronting adaptations, not just in ourselves, but these adaptations we want to see in others. So much that we're hungry for people to adapt, and we want to match that need to adapt with the capacity. So other questions, other comments that you've seen or understood or want to bring up, either from your small group or for what you're facing, please raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you. There's some happening in the chat, but anyone want to raise a question? Other ideas? Joanna, let's hear from you.
Yeah, it's not a fully formed thought that I'm having, so I'm just going to fling some things out there and see what happens. When you spoke about the luxury of having adaptive capacity and how many humans are involved with taking care of my survival on a daily basis so that I have food, etc. I think because I'm deeply immersed in inclusion work as well, I'm particularly interested in adapting in myself, my capacity to see and be curious about all the other humans that are part of the luxury. I'm talking about privilege, obviously. And I guess I'm interested in myself and for others, including to sort of coil in and be in fear and really be in survival mode. Can I actually transform to what might seem paradoxical, which is a hugely expanded awareness of the system of power inequities that I'm a part of, even here in Canada, where we profess to be so enlightened around this particular domain. So yeah, there's not a clear question in that. It's more just a domain that I'm curious about as it relates to adaptation. Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to thank you for offering a messy thought or question. There's so many spaces in our lives where we have to show up in a community as pristine, and that's the last thing we want to create here. Yeah. And so the thought process that unfolds, I think, is what the space we want to create. I think two things to say. I think, and other people, I'd be interested in other people's thoughts on this. One of the challenges or the framework of adaptive change is, by definition, where we draw the boundaries on it. And so part of what this is inviting is a very beautiful and difficult question of who are we drawing the boundaries around, of who we care for and what we look at, knowing how easy it is to draw them narrowly. And so part of what I think a good crisis does is it removes our blind spots of our own fragility, of our own boundaries, of our old definitions. And so part of why this time is threatening is because the boundaries or sort of container that I had are now exposed as being less safe and less grounded. And so yes, the reaction to withdraw and hunker down is very real, but we want to do that with realistic eyes and not false premise. And that's the challenge of this. That's the hopeful sort of dual awakening, that we're so dependent on each other, that the heroes of the essential workers are really what allows us to have the freedom of this conversation. And yes, as we've talked about, the privilege to not look at that stuff is real, but it's also capacity. It's also skill set. What is the skill set of understanding where my system is and what I'm drawing for? One of the people in the comments helped me remember that I didn't share in looking at the Sakura tree that my daughter's also named Sakura. And there's a Japanese saying, itadakimasu, at the beginning of a meal, that says, thank you for the food that's on my table and the journey it took to get there. And so part of what we want to think about is not honor the fact that we want to hunker down and feel some guilt, but also think about what is the competence, what is the skill set of engaging the next circle out of who I'm dependent on. If I think about that, what is the next, how do I get good at that? How do I ask people about where they are and what their needs are for help? So I want to honor both the feelings of that. And Joanna, you and I could have a longer conversation about how skilled are we of dealing with guilt? How skilled are we of dealing with privilege? And like all of these are ideas that we can build capacity to address, not just say, oh, this is hard, right? This is about building the muscle and skill set to face those things. And beautifully in the world, there's lots of models on dealing with privilege, on diversity, on dependency. But you can see the desire to get smaller. Sometimes that's out of safety, sometimes that's out of incompetence.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you moving this beyond the awareness conversation into skill and competency. That's one of my big takeaways from this. So thank you for that.
Yeah, we're also in a society that often rewards the awareness. I can't tell you how many communities I'm in that reward sort of people for naming a problem really well and then working around it rather than addressing it. And so I just want to be in communities that can honestly talk about the awareness piece of what's happening and be supportive of each other and how do we face it, not name it and then think that the work is done. Other comments, other questions? Yeah, Tim, let's hear from you. You're on, yeah, thanks for coming off of mute.
Sure, thanks. So this may be following up on what you just said. I've had the experience both around the COVID experience and then just in normal everyday leadership, where I've offered an interpretation and it's framed as a tentative interpretation, and I receive and don't know how to work around the silence that I get. I think I'm inviting people to share their interpretation, but there must be something I'm doing or it's just a natural human dynamic where the sharing of interpretation, where I think it's going to draw people into a conversation, tends to silence the group, has been my experience. So maybe I'm just really bad at offering interpretations.
No, I think you're good at it and we want you to be better at it. And it doesn't take one pass. I think it's worth saying for those who also don't know you, that you're also the CEO or you're the biggest person in the organization. And so when someone at the top of the organization says, I want other interpretations, that invitation is quite different than dealing with a peer or someone else. And what happens when we're at the top of an organization is we think that we see everything and we're creating this beautiful space for people to show up, but people filter and censor themselves when they do that. So I would love to know in your organization, what's the history of people saying something hard or difficult or sharing a different interpretation and what happened to them? Because in a way, we're always trying to train each other of how to show up. And if you are the CEO or the president or the boss, then what the safety rules and ground you have to set for people to be able to show up is really important. And what we find and what's one of the most beautiful things that's happening now of bosses, of people in power, is more often than not, they're not just making a decision or an invitation, they're saying the values that exist behind it. Here's why I'm offering interpretation. Here's why I need to hear others. When someone in power says, I'm offering an interpretation and I'm doing that because I know I have blind spots and I know I need to see more, there are ways in which to invite actual conversation in a way that's more than just, I have an interpretation. So I love you, Tim, for your willingness to engage in the authenticity with which you invite it. But what is the construct with which you're inviting it to? And how do we actually acknowledge that there's power and difference in that invitation? And how do they experience what they hear from you when they respond? So my message would just be keep going, but let's do it in sort of a wider frame. Other comments, other questions, other responses to either Tim or Joanna's questions or thoughts? Yes. What do we got? Adderall.
So if you could expound a bit more on how what you just explained and Tim opening up and inviting in and it kind of falling on deaf ears. Like I too received that frustration. And I feel like my fingers is on the pulse of what's happening, and my boss's fingers are not on that pulse. And just take this crisis, for example. We're literally trying to keep people safe and save lives, and how we do that is important. And I think the outcomes of our normal productivity has overshadowed the crises and keeping people aligned with the mission and keeping people safe. And not to be the bearer of bad news every time that it's derailed, which our mission should be would be wise to be in the forefront of what we do at all times. And if keeping people safe is that, how are we doing anything different?
Yeah, there's a lot in that. Also, Daisy and Valerie are also on this call who have spent time in their life thinking about how do we get different voices heard. So I invite them to comment as well as anyone else. Let me come back to the frame from Tim's conversation, because what I heard you asking first is about a little bit of the power, which was also in Helen's question about power over or, power with. I think we talked about this in a previous call, but just to reiterate, when we have power over, this is a framework that I'm spending more time on, when we have power over someone else, the people in power think they see the whole system, but that's actually a myth. And what happens when you have power over is you create blind spots to how the system is and your behavior, because you don't see and experience the dysfunction of the system in the same way. People underneath that power have sore spots for how the system's broken. So in a simple frame, you have this model of blind spots and sore spots of how the system exists. And so part of the question that Helen was asking is, how do I get people in power to witness and see what's really happening, to overcome their blind spots, and to see the truth or other data points? Now, I think there was an interesting set of questions that was brought up there. And in the framework we're playing with today, do they even see it? Are they even aware of what's happening? What's the skill set that we have? Because part of this call is about competency. What's the skill set of bringing information, difficult information up? That's one piece, right? A second piece is around their skill set and be able to handle and hold it and witness it, right? How do we present information, not because it's the right thing that someone has to see? How do we present that information into the listening of the audience, right? How many PowerPoints have you seen that are like, this is what has to happen, and totally unaware of the language that will actually allow the other person to digest it, right? So that's a skill set in and of itself. How do we help someone see a blind spot? Might be the greatest skill set you could have as a parent, as a partner, as an employee, as a member of a community, right? But there's a skill set there of naming, of language, of pacing, of presentation, right? And part of what we know is what we're doing when we have to present information up to people in power, the last thing that you want to do is be the only person presenting it, because then you're a lightning rod and you can be the scapegoat for not wanting to address it. And so community organizing of how do we get people without power to speak with collective voice and collective action is another capacity and skill set that's useful to speak up, right? So again, I think those are just ways I begin to see the useful question of how do we lead and manage up, which is about not just awareness, but of some empathy and compassion, and some very developed skill sets of how do I present and frame conversations? How do I sit in ambiguity? How do I sit in conflict and maintain relationship? So if we start to look at that, we can understand what the work is that we'd have to do, but also every single one of those has a skill set that would be much better to have a black belt in than a yellow belt in. How do I raise difficult issues, right? I would love to get better at that every 3 months. Right? And if I keep doing that, my capacity to do that. Again, I don't think it's always the default or negligence of people in power to have blind spots. I think systemically that does it itself. So those are just some ideas I begin to think about. Daisy, Valerie, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you had something to add, I would welcome it. I think this challenge of how do we get people in power to see a broader, more inclusive reality of where this COVID crisis and where other things are landing is one of the critical skill sets of our time. So Valerie or Daisy, do you want to add anything to that? And I know I'm putting you on a spot, so don't mean to put pressure on you.
I'm not used to that at all.
I'm just offering it.
Yes, it's germane to now, but it extends well beyond now, right? And gosh, there's so much great stuff where to jump in. With respect to how to get folks, wherever they are in the power continuum, to pay attention, to listen. One thing I learned from a great friend named Marcia Redman, who's a communications consultant for lawyers. I'm a recovering lawyer. She said, you got to hit him in the whiffum, but what's in it for me principle. Because if I haven't earned your eyes, your ears, your bandwidth yet, it might be that I need to show you how you can benefit first. And then once you understand, oh, to use your phrasing, I have this blind spot or I could do this better, it may also be that because of your position, you are very uncomfortable admitting that you don't know something. And so if I can gently show you not just what, but how, in a way that gives you space to learn how without losing anything, then that can be a great benefit. And psych safety is huge. When you're creating space for people of less power and influence to contribute to you. I've reported to CEO, never been a CEO, right? But it's a delicate dance when our boss asks, what should I be doing better? And you're like, how honest should I be? Psych safety is real and you can create it. And the person with the most power in the room tends to dictate how safe one can be leaning in and taking a risk. So what are you doing and saying to demonstrate how safe people are to take risks, how safe you are taking risks? And does what you say and what you do align? What's your say-do ratio? Because one can always wipe out the other. And I'll stop there and let Daisy dive in. I know you've got tons to say.
Yeah, thank you. I think everything that you said is spot on, and being able to help find the grace and the patience to work through this is really challenging. I think one of the things that we also have to be mindful of, and to your point, is this isn't just in this moment, but women, people of color, and other underrepresented and marginalized communities and identities, we've been used to making ourselves smaller, quieter, and easy to get along with to survive in organizational context. And so this particular situation is raising anxieties across the board for everyone. But the fact of the matter is that we're all experiencing this very differently, and already coming from places, as Zander was saying, where these sore spots, that these sore spots have never healed. And now they're just, the Band-Aids that we've been putting on for years are just, these are gaping wounds right now. And so I think that there's the element of we're trying to address the today, but we're also trying to address it in a systemic environment that has been hindering people for so long. And I think the options for leaders now and the opportunities for leaders now. I heard someone say that CEOs are now chief empathy officers. And I was like, well, okay, great. Well, then how do you lean into that? And how do you build muscles that you haven't built before at a time that you're being also asked to do a million other things that you've never been asked to do before? And I think it's just going to require a patience that evades the best of us and a consistency of lifting up these issues and lifting up the real human impact in your organizations.
Yeah. As we've talked about in this series, a crisis reveals how broken the system is for so long. And because part of just to reinforce the framework that we're talking about at the start of this, part of what we want to look at is what is the level of work? Is the level of work of awareness? Is it about willingness? Is it about bandwidth or skill set, right? And so we're asking a bunch of CEOs to be chief empathy officers, and we would have to look at it from each of those. What is their capacity to be empathetic, right? In this model that I found quite useful, and to honor Van Jones, who worked on it with me and came up with it, the blind spots at the top are not just blind spots to their own limitations, but they're blind spots actually to the sore spots of the other people. They actually don't see how it's broken. And so asking people who have suffered then to speak up to power of how the system's broken is an unfair burden often. And so part of the question is, what do all of us do as parts of these systems with whatever bandwidth we have to address them, so those who are most affected by them don't then have to also be their solo advocate in speaking up. And so that's where a lot of the work is around allyship and other people to think about how they embrace these. But again, my experience, because I'm such a pragmatist and so committed to change, is not just identifying where the work is, that's part one, but what is the skill set to actually do that work is important. And the beautiful thing about us humans is that we can learn something very quickly, right? And so I would ask each of us, what is the skill set we need to learn that's required in doing this work that we're going to get better at iteratively? Sarah, you had a comment or question. Let's turn to you.
Hi, my kids are in the background, so I hope I don't get interrupted. Who knows? I just wanted to make an observation about the interaction between you and Tim. Tim made an interpretation about his own capacity to interpret, which was, maybe I'm not very good at interpreting. And you said, no, you're good. We just want you to get better. And it was, for me, that was really neat, because I kind of thought maybe there's something, Tim, I don't know you at all. I know Zander a little bit. But there was something in it for me about what are people's capacity to think of Tim as somebody who's not capable? How much tolerance do we have for Tim being his capacity being limited in some way? And that I kind of began thinking about authority and how do we administer even doubt and vulnerability and volatility with the right measure, like a medicine, with the right measure that people can tolerate being able to hold that kind of uncertainty, even from somebody. It's the kind of skill that you talked about before, but it was just neat to see it in the conversation.
Yeah, great. Well, it'd be fun to hear how it landed with Tim, but it would also be good to notice, when does the competency or default pattern of when does someone start with a personal interpretation of themselves versus an interpretation of how the system has constructed them. One of the things that happens when you enter this world of work in these communities is there's all this personal development, and people think that there's an incredible agent of change and possibility and manifestation, and I love some of that. And we are very much socially constructed beings. And the environments and constructs that we are in shape how we show up, what's possible, what's permissible. And so not only was I want to be helpful and supportive of Tim, who's doing heroic work in what he's trying to achieve, but also to offer that it isn't all about him or any of us. There's a system of construct that we're living in that's creating those norms and realities. And how do we have the skill set to land in both of them? Sarah, keep going. But I think we want to have the capacity in the systemic analysis and the personal analysis. And that's where the real learning can be, because we are in this, in my experience, this really beautiful, challenging dialogue with reality, where as we understand what reality is, the understanding of what that means for ourselves grows. And as we know what we want for ourselves, what we want for reality changes. And I think that's part of what the capacity we may want to look at. But Sarah, do you want to continue?
No, I just wanted to say it's really helpful, because the question I wanted to ask earlier was the distinction between self and role and how it can help us. And I think what you're talking to is that distinction, like this kind of stories we're telling ourselves, and the role people, the kind of the stuff that people are putting on us in our positions and systems. So yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Great. Jonathan, let's turn to you and your comment or question, and then we'll go to Natasha after that.
Hey, Tim, I just wanted to empathize with you. Sometimes I don't listen very well. And one of the things that, when I've taken a step back of that and wondered why people aren't thinking the same thing that I am, I realized that I've done these things and read these books and had these thought processes that got me to where I am. And everybody else has awesome different thought processes that got them to where they are. And if I don't find a way to share my journey with them, then I can't expect them to connect with me on the same level that I'm thinking of, whatever problem it is. One of the tools that we've been able to be able to implement is books. And so books are the fastest way straight into somebody's brain with the kind of ideas that I have, because I read a book and then I come out with things that I found useful. And one of the tools in a long-term cultural shift for different businesses and our team is something called Better Book Club, and where we can sign up as a company and choose books that we want and choose questions, and then we choose how to reward people for either do a bonus or a celebration of who reads it. But that tells the people that we're working with exactly what we're reading, and then we put the questions that we choose in there of exactly what we thought about that book, and we can get their opinions on it and see them, because they can write them out or however you want it. And then that way we're in a long-term play of trying to be on the same page in thought process and culture.
Thank you, Jonathan. I love people who still love books. One of the nuanced things to watch for, though, is what are we asking people to make interpretations of? And when we use a book or device of let's look at this neutral thing and let's make interpretations of that, that's different than we're asking people to interpret something with consequence and power in the center of it. And so just to kind of watch where we practice and honor people to make different interpretations is really helpful.
And that's actually one of the last things, was asking Valerie and Daisy to name a book that that invites people to, that says other opinions in the workplace like you're asking for are good, and it shapes that, how you want it to be taken, and then maybe talking to them, having them read that.
Yeah, that's great. So Daisy or Valerie, or anyone who has other books you think that are consequential for how we learn to look at reality or make different interpretations, maybe share that in the chat. One of the best piece of advice I'd ever say, just in a funny moment, from my mentor when I was a young single person, was that if you're dating someone and they don't have any books in their house, don't sleep with them. That people who read and interpret and reflect is a useful thing. So let's go to Natasha. You had a question or comment? Natasha Cherry, can we hear from you, or either you're on mute?
Yes.
Okay.
Hello?
Yeah. Hi, thank you. Yeah, we can hear you now.
So yes, I guess something that I'm challenged with now is feeling powerless, not able to, I work with for a charter school network, and I do a lot of community work as well. So I help like all of the people that are being hit by this the hardest. We have a lot of families that don't have access to food and are losing jobs, and just have just the basic things that we take for granted. They don't have it. I have to figure out how to get toilet tissue and sanitary pads to a family that needs that now. So it's like dealing with and trying to help people when you kind of like, everyone's kind of living in their bubble, they're sheltered in. Do they want to go out, and how can they go out safely and go to stores and get things for people and help people or direct them to pantries and the places that they need to go to? So like, how do you do that and be of service to people that are in really serious need right now? And then there are some bigger things that can't even begin to tackle, like our families that don't have access to Wi-Fi because of where they live. You know, they live in the projects and there's no way to even get it. If there's no bandwidth, you can't get the Wi-Fi. So like, trying to just be of service and trying to help people that are really in dire straits right now is a challenge.
Yeah. So a few things just to say, and I'm a little conscious of time at the end of this call. One is, if there's a few ways that this community can help you and some of that community, please let us know. And we have access to others and bodies who can do lots of things and help people. That's one. Second, the feeling of powerlessness is a real feeling and a reality. And so part of that is trying to understand what are the skill sets in that experience. We've spent one of the previous calls talking about the process of letting go and hospice. How do we let go with grace those things we can no longer control? I don't want to rush to let go or hospice this community of people in need. I want to also figure out what is the skill set of letting go and what is the skill set of asking for help. And underneath that is a different skill set that we're not talking about enough. What is the skill set of advocacy and public protest and alarm raising for some of the things that we don't want to look at? All of those things are competencies, not just desires, that I think we want to think about how we can help. But I think, Natasha, if there are a few things that people in this community can do for members of the community of who you're looking out for, please let us know in the chat or just email me and we can share it more broadly. I am conscious also of the time. If there's a question we didn't get to, please let us know. I think the things to say are, one, again, as always, thank you for the quality of the conversation in this community coming together. Again, we wanted it to be places where we can wrestle and not be our pristine self, but our real self of what we're facing. Next week, we're going to do a detailed session on leadership and authority and what's happening in the world, but also how do we understand those and how do we engage with them, which has lots of consequence from political figures on down. So please, if you want to join us for that or invite others to come to that. But again, for so many of us, including myself, I just want to thank Rachel as well. This community and the spaces and these relationships are one of the ways we're figuring out how to ask for help and build some of the competencies we need. So thank you very much for coming together. I appreciate all of you.
Thanks, Zander.
Thanks, Zander.
Thank you, Zander.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Rachel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank you
you. Thanks,
very much.
Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good day.
Thank you.